It's a great pleasure to have Dr. Nawang Phuntsog here to deliver this very interesting talk on fostering compassionate Tibetan nationalism and the middle way approach. Success. It's very interesting in the sense that even from a first glance, because the topic nationalism is a very important topic. In Tibetan, it could be translated something like Jaje or Gyalhin, because you use the word nationalism, patriotism in a quite similar way sometimes. Then beyond nationalism, we also these days talk much about internationalism. In Tibetan, we have many interesting different words like Lungxin, Cholshin, Chogal Shengo, Lungze Shengo. So many areas where you can have this nationalism or patriotism, in many cases false patriotism. It's in the human history. If you read the human history, it is but natural that that particular nation or that particular community faces threat. Then they are compelled to pull their resources and energy, everything together to show their solidarity, and then they call it regionalism or whatever. In ancient times, there are stories of some places where people had shortage of food and everything, and then they become just robbers. And their job is to go everywhere and loot people, kill people, to get the food they want to eat. So they were really not so different from pack of wild animals. But later on, many thinkers, they say that we need to be very careful with this concept of nationalism, because the perverted source of nationalism will lead you to become really a pack of animals, jackals, whose aim is just to destroy the other one and take advantage, and that's all. But human life is not that simple because of this amazing brain. It's very, very complicated. So the solution has to be found not through one side victory and other side total, defeat. It has to be achieved through mutual understanding. Thereby, this other term, middle way, is so important in general, and especially in our Tibetan process of, finding peace and solving any problem. That's why these days many great thinkers, they emphasize more on soft power than on hard power. Hard power is the military might, kill others and gain victory. Soft power is it's the power of culture. So therefore, this interesting topic is very much related to not only the survival of a particular community, but also how can we promote this narrow-minded nationalism into a bigger, all sentient being focused patriotism, something like that. So that way we are able to bring long-lasting peace and happiness. So therefore, without wasting time, once again I would like to say how pleased we are, because last year also Professor came here and he gave a talk, and probably this will become an annual event for many years to come. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Karsure tambu gesing tolia gesing ki kansa jimbe chane tambu pyoge tol tes mashubina jiktagda ra jungmendo kansna gesing gi ringlu gtawen ya kei di shubuch kechimbo miri gi yala lakire chatu de tinja sonza nya tambu pyoge tol tes mashubina ini ya krans tuline di geshin tol gesing de mit kande jina sam kungzura btinde tes manda me sam tawar bchung ende da tangbu shuer btila ya de nganzu pensu khange ngaya de tungji shida yagmana song dinde sonza gishalatla tsöbe de geshina so samaya ning tawane ngone tochi shugi en de maze tanda karsugoda pensu khange de 바게 파슈다 튼게 망고지 나야 표조단의 국업제 te maze page penso khan ran nang ya nganzo library nang ya chala nang ya khona mishi ngashtu en khona zole ya nge chi kharsu re thep din na ra shu na lamsa thega tu nyebyo thone nang je din chi chinsa khonzole ya mixe nge ning thawan na to chi shu yi ene teda tango to zrab shu jila sebe lenge zu gashi ji kendo khabri nge ki tanda kharsu re sebe chige khal ya chige lega che dan ta na ji namjun ya chik shimju che de shiri tholi mando chi ya ji kharsu re phube ge tholi mixe gi shimju chinge gi dinde zawane me yine ji nga pheba ji me chane phube tholi ya shimju che ya lo yorobsne tende lo yo yine ta lo yoba tang chi kharsu so so tözö tang na shi chi ge kugap dinde mara che sonza chi de chi shor le so rob cha je de chi de so lenge so ya gong da xue yin internet 다른 데 용체 제베 개신 토리아 데 심주 제 주전에 테블로 서버데 망부싱에 로비 로 주전 데원에 타는 가라리아 슈주 소나 가르쳐 슈비나 세베 가라랑기 개신기 지yor bata tadi ngone tane yabu resha pyuta resha se sorbji tolia samzu tolia tes gyorab chinje dingara shira phembuchung shwejik di ene tabeji ngege kharsure inge tol shunati chobch ene kharsugata ngo shuyati ge peji shu sarubji. So now I'm going to actually switch to English language because this is the language that I use for my research project. And this is the agenda for this afternoon's presentation. And my first part of the agenda really includes sharing with you a couple of selected quotes and a module that can be used to study Tibetan identity formation. So I'm going to do that. And then my next section is really looking at this notion of nation itself. Since you know Tibet is an occupied country, and so I wasn't very sure whether I would be able to apply this notion of nationalism to Tibet. Hence, I had to really read a lot of books on nationalism, particularly the works of Benedict Anderson. He is supposed to be the intellectual giant on nationalism. So I'm going to share with you, where my thinking is with regard to relationship to nation, and nationalism a little later. And then there is a lot of thinking these days, particularly in the Tibetan studies scholarship, that during and before Cultural Revolution, of course, Tibet experienced a huge darkest year, in fact, one might say. And hence, people tend to think that there is actually a rupture rather than continuity of Tibetan literature. So, I want to really get a sense of the continuity and persistence of Tibetan literature. So, I'm going to talk about that a little later. And then structure and definition of Tibetan nationalism. So, I'm going to offer you a definition of Tibetan nationalism as I have understood at this point. So these four sections actually include more or less my literature review section of my presentation. And then, of course, I'm going to focus on my current research project, beginning with the purpose, research questions, and some sense of tentative analysis. And then I think you're going to like this children's drawing activity that I'm going to share with you at the end. So that is my agenda for this afternoon. Now let me begin with these quotes. And I have intentionally, deliberately selected these quotes as a way to really highlight the importance of paying attention to the concept of nationalism. And of course, Tibetan nationalism in specific terms. So look at the first quote from Professor Dawan. In his book, Culture and the Politics of Third World Nationalism, he does not make a specific reference to Tibet or Tibetan nationalism. But I think he was thinking about Tibetan nationalism at the point of writing this particular observation in his book. This was in 1992 when he shared this observation that unless and until we pay attention to nationalism, this particular sleeping beauty could very well turn out to be a Frankenstein's monster. You know, so, you know, I think we have a responsibility to make sure that this sleeping beauty, rather than becoming a monster, becomes really an icon of universal compassion, particularly merging Tibetan nationalism and middle way approach. I'm going to talk about that a little later as well. Then look at the second quote from Shokthung, who is considered an intellectual from Tibet. And again, here in this quotation, he is actually raising our awareness that unless we do something about Tibetan nationalism and also Chinese nationalism, these two nationalisms could really collide together in a way that could lead to a lot of unhappy outcomes. And so I became very clear that there is really a need for us to pay attention to this issue of Tibetan nationalism so that it would not really go in that direction. And then, of course, during and before Cultural Revolution, as I was telling you earlier, Tibetan identity experienced a huge threat. It was under threat. It was under assault, definitely. So again, some scholars have really pointed out that Tibetan nationalism, Tibetan identity is a dead issue, essentially, practically, because of the wanton destruction that Tibet has experienced before and during Cultural Revolution. So I'm actually going to challenge this particular narrative a little later, along with the works of Lama Jap. And then this next one, again, brings to our attention that in the 1980s, right actually after the end of Cultural Revolution, of course, Tibet experienced a little bit of a liberalization. There was less restriction and things like that. So this was the era, actually, you will begin to see that there was a lot of activities, particularly with regard to literary activities. And so what I really realized is that this was really the watershed movement in the Tibetan nationalism, particularly rekindling the Tibetan nationalism in Tibet. Oh, perfect. This module, which I find very simple and elegant. And of course, there are many, many modules like that you can easily find on a web or something in order for you to find out the identity formation. But I really like this one because of its simplicity and elegance. So this particular module is based on two attributes. One is commitment, and the other one is the exploration. So when you intersect these two attributes, you end up with 4 corners. So now I'm going to discuss each corner in relationship to Tibetan national identity. Hopefully this will be helpful for us in the future. Look at the first one, which is called foreclosed identity. A person who is at this particular stage or phase, foreclosed, is one who might very strongly identify with one's region. For example, I might say I'm Sangpa and Amdo or things like that. Or, you know, your identification could be based on kind of like Tibetan schools that you belong to, particularly Buddhist schools. So I might say I am a Kilukpa or I am a Nyingmapa, Kajupa, things like that. So, and of course, there's nothing wrong with this identification. But all I'm trying to say is I'm using this as examples to share with you what this foreclosed identity looks like. It's kind of like a minimum way of identifying with your national identity. So now I'm going to move to the next one, which is called diffused. So an individual at this particular phase may say, I'm just a Tibetan. I don't want to talk about regional like areas that I identify with or sect and things like that. So, he might say, I'm a Tibetan or I'm an internationalist, I'm an Indian, Tibetan, whatever, like he or she feels like identifying with. So this would be called as a diffuse kind of like identification phase. So now we move to the next one, which is called moratorium. So when an individual is at this stage, moratorium, he or she actually shows a lot of interest to explore. So this was my experience when I came to Dharamsala at this time in the summer. I really read a lot of books on Tibetan, different schools of religion, different schools of Buddhism. I read a little bit of a history. So for me, this was really the moratorium stage. I spent a lot of time in the library reading as much as possible about Tibetan literature, Tibetan language, Tibetan, things like that. So for me, this was really like a moratorium stage. I was intensely involved in exploration. It was more of a journey of discovery for me. Of course, to begin with, I knew I'm a Tibetan, but I wasn't exactly sure, as to what are the attributes that would make me a Tibetan, individual. So this kind of like exploration, studying really helped me. So the important phase of this moratorium is that it will easily lead to that next phase, which is called achieved phase. So here an individual has a very balanced sense of himself or herself. And he or she is on a continual process of figuring out his or her identity. So if you look at this module, any one of us may be at the foreclosed, diffuse, but if you take the next step, that is you develop interest to explore your identity, read books, talk to people, engage in discussion, and this exploration will lead us to this achieved phase. So another thing that I realize is that if we all remain at this foreclosed phase, then it will be impossible to implement middle way approach, because we would be all engaged in some kind of infighting to some extent. In order to achieve the goals of middle way, I think it is very crucial that we move to the final phase, which is the achieved phase. Hopefully, this is where we will really develop a very strong sense of Tibetan nationalism. So now we move to the next part of my presentation. As I was telling you, since Tibet is an occupied country, and I wasn't really sure whether this concept of nation can be applied to study of Tibetan nationalism. So I had to do some research, I had to do a lot of reading and things like that. So this is what I found. Rousseau was the first one who actually rejected this elitist equation of nationalism with ruling class. And he is the one who said we must really emphasize peoplehood instead of this, bourgeois kind of like ruling class connotation. And because of his emphasis, if you look at the next one, Nawang also made it very clear that people belonging to all, like different political thinking systems, they have now accepted that the idea of notion must, associate with people. So I kind of really like what I found. And then, of course, the next one is, again, very interesting kind of a thing I want to share with you. The theory of nationalism has been Marxism's great historical failure. The central principle of Marxism is its focus on class interest. They tend to think that class interest is more important than national interest. So once the class issue is addressed, and they have assumed that the national issue will come to an end. And I think they apply the same thinking to Tibetan, situation in Tibet, particularly after the end of Cultural Revolution. So I will get to that a little later. And then, of course, the Latin root word nato also means people. And this particular concept aligns very well with Benedict Anderson's concept of imagined community. And also I like the fact that he said it's more than this imagined community, but an imagined community with deep horizontal relationship. Deep horizontal relationship. And then look the next one. Nationality, nationalness, or nationalism are cultural artifacts of a specific kind. So I think, our Tibetan nationalism can very easily align with this kind of a thinking. The next one is, again, a French philosopher, theorist, and he actually is cited very much in many different books. And so I became very curious as to what he wrote. He wrote a very famous essay called What is a Nation? And so I Googled his name, and it's about 2-3 pages. And I really like the way he thought of the concept of nationalism. For him, nationalism is a soul or the spiritual principle. This kind of thing aligns very well with our way of thinking about Tibetan nationalism. So this is really a soul that is embedded in this collective past history. So very much past-oriented. But at the same time, there is huge willingness to make sure that this rich legacy from the past will continue. So I think we all have the same urge as Tibetans. We not only appreciate our rich cultural history, but we have a huge desire to make sure that this would continue from generation after generation. And then again, he makes this observation, it's very interesting. Suffering in common unifies more than joy. So I was thinking about this, how does this apply to our Tibetan situation? And of course, whenever we hear self-immolation taking place in Tibet, I think all of us really cry in solitude or collectively. Not only that, we are kind of energized in some ways. We realize that there is this urgency to do something collectively to bring an end to this suffering in Tibet. So I think what he says is very true. It rings very well, aligns very well with our situation. And of course, joy is very easy to kind of like celebrate and things like that. There are, of course, several occasions in the Tibetan community in exile, as well as in Tibet, in terms of this celebration. And then I like the observation made by Norbu and Lama Jab. A nation may desire, of course, who wouldn't desire a state? But then its lack does not preclude the existence of nation. Now I was thinking, how does this really, work in a real situation? And then I realized, look at India. India was under the British rule for 200 years. But during the, British, colonial rule in India, India was still very much an Indian nation. And if you read the works of Rabindranath Tagore, Sri Aurobindo, or Jawaharlal Nehru, they were actively engaged in discussion, even before independence, as to how they are going to define the future of Indian nationality. So then it became very clear to me that we can be also very actively engaged in our discussion as to how we want to shape the future of Tibetan nationalism, just as these folks did while they were under the British actually colonial rule. And I really, many of you may be interested in this notion of nationalism. I really would like to urge. There's a small book written by Rabindranath Tagore is on nationalism. I think if you read that book, you will really benefit a lot. And there was one sort of element I like to bring to your attention. What he said, he really was very much, of course, interested in shaping Indian nationalism. But at the same time, he was very accurately aware that issue of nationalism should not undermine humanity. He said if he were given a choice between Indian nationalism and humanity, he would always choose humanity over anti-nationalism. Also, although he said, I'm a very, very strong Indian in thinking, in action, and whatnot. So I think we can learn something from him. So I thought I'd just share that with you. And then look at Lama Jap. I really enjoyed reading his book. It is a marvelous work he has done. And so what he has done is he has really looked at the continuity of Tibetan oral and literary tradition. He wanted to challenge this notion of rupture, as if there was a huge break, particularly after this 1980s, when the new Tibetan studies began to blossom in Tibet and elsewhere. So he really wanted to challenge that notion. And I think he has successfully challenged the notion, in his writing and in his research. So what he has said actually in his book, in the nutshell, in Tibet, there has never been a rupture. Never. There was indeed continuity, persistence, based on the fact that modern writers in Tibet, they frequently make reference to the past. Frequently. Past is evoked very, very frequently. In fact, the past and the present, they kind of collide with each other in terms of ensuring a very productive literary practices in Tibet. So this kind of intersection also informs our national consciousness, Tibetan national consciousness, very contemporary Tibetan national consciousness. And then lastly from this section, I really want to emphasize this relationship between Buddhism and Tibetan national identity. I think is a very unique, one-of-a-kind type in the world. Of course, there are other religious, systems in the world, which have played very important role. I'm not suggesting, that Tibetan Buddhism is the only one. But I think within the Tibetan context, Buddhism has played a very important, vital role in terms of unifying the Tibetan people. In terms of really being able to live through the most traumatic experience in our history, I think Buddhism is the one that has allowed us to really sort of move forward without looking back and being very unhappy, really allowed us to move forward and then take on the challenges. Okay, moving along. Okay, here we go. So now, I truly appreciate Dawa Nupur's work, although he never made any direct reference to Tibetan nationalism. But what he said in terms of functions of culture, particularly nationalism producing aspect of culture, he said, it needs to include a religious text. And of course, we have plenty of religious texts, plenty. So we are very fortunate in that respect. And then a galaxy of cultural heroes. I'm going to actually bring to attention. We have, again, many of those, beginning with Thumisambhoda, Songtsen Gampo, and Sakya Pantitha, Marpa and Miller. Many people who would provide us this, this role model, this, cultural icon that we can, in fact, admire, appreciate, and, follow their footsteps somehow. And then a national writing system. I think we have a very unique language which unites all of us. In many countries, they encounter huge difficulties with lack of one common language. But this is not the case with the Tibetan situation. So I think, Thumisambhoda was really an extraordinary individual who really gave us this beautiful gift of Tibetan script, which has this adaptability. Am I right when you're doing translation? Very rich in lexicon and whatnot. So I think we owe a lot to Thumisambhoda, really. Personally, I feel kind of like, I wish I could make my prostrations to him at some point. So, we have this wonderful national writing system. And then, of course, collective social history. So we have all these qualities that would really make us a very unique community. That would really allow us to really imagine ourselves as a community very easily through these shared, collective, cultural, historical, linguistic sort of like, memories. I really want to base my next few sections on this particular construct, functions of culture in a nationalism-producing kind of situation. So then when I was doing some research, I want to really find out as much as possible who are the cultural heroes from the early ages, and what are some of these interesting cultural traditions, that may exist to this day. That would provide a strong sense of unity, strong sense of nationalism. So then I found, this Tibetans are very fond of mountains and rivers and things like that. So they have developed very interesting eulogies, sort of like appreciation of the mountain relationships. So this is actually a very interesting part of our national identity as well. And then also we have developed, like mountain worship practices. So I just want to bring this to your attention. One eulogy based on Mr. Karme. Again, Karme visited Tibet several times to undertake his ethnographic research in terms of looking at how do Tibetans express their fondness, their relationship to local, mountains and rivers and things like that. So he actually shared this in his short essay. Tibet is the high and its land is pure. Its snowy mountains are at the head of everything. The source of innumerable rivers and streams is the center of the spheres of gods. So I just want to kind of share this one with you. And then look at some of the mountain worship practices. Again, mountains have become a very important symbol of nationalism for Tibetans. And I really love the way that Tibetans sort of like engage in this incense burning and, scarf offering to the mountains. It's almost, you can embrace them, you can cuddle them. What a beautiful way to establish bonding relationship with mountains. I think it's a very beautiful practice. And of course, this practice continues undiminished to this day, according to Mr. Karme. Look at this mountain in Kongpo, Hlari Gyangto. Now, again, this mountain has huge national symbolism for Tibetans, because this is the mountain on which the first king, Nyadi, he descended from heaven on the top of this mountain. So it has huge national symbolism for us. And then look at the next mountain, Yalashempu in Yalung. And I think this is also such an important symbolism for us. It was the, ancestral deity of Yalung dynasty, the first sort of like, kingdom in Tibet. Ancestral deity of Tibetan kings, particularly the early kings. And then it's also the ancestral deity of King Kesar. So, like three things are sort of like combined in this particular mountain worship practice. And then Mount Amnyamachin in Amto is considered to be the soul of Kesar as well as Tibet. So I think the more you and I are informed about these mountain cult practices, naturally you and our, sense of nationalism grows within us. I mean, I actually sort of like was so intrigued with all these practices. And I won't read more, but there were not a whole lot of literature read in English. And so I just wanted to bring to attention at least some of these mountain worship practices. And now I want to focus a little bit in terms of, religious text. Remember, like that is one part of this, like nationalism producing aspect of culture. And so, of course, we know Bon is the indigenous religion of Tibet until Buddhism was introduced in Tibet by King Songtse Gampo in the 7th century. And then I truly realized that introduction of written script as well as Buddhism in Tibet in the 7th century, I think must be considered as one of the most important national consciousness raising events in history. Imagine if we did not have this kind of a national consciousness raising events in Tibet, we could have had a very different story altogether. It was Thimi who introduced Tibetan written script, which unified all of us. And it is Buddhism introduced during the time of King Sungzang Gampo that continues to unify all of us. Not only with the Tibetans, but with other fellows who might be interested in Tibetan Buddhism. So I think, we need to pay a lot of attention to this aspect of the history. I think I'm done with all of this. Yes. And then Thimi Sambuddha is, in fact, the first translator. And I began to realize that he was not only a translator, but he was a linguist. He studied Sanskrit. He devised this Tibetan script. I mean, he was a linguist, one of a kind, who didn't study linguists at all, but he was a gifted linguist. And he was also an educator. He translated many texts from Sanskrit. So Thimi Sambuddha to me is a wonderful cultural icon for all of us. Really, what a wonderful cultural icon, who was a nationalist because of the fact that he introduced Tibetan script. He introduced Tibetan Buddhism. Who could be more nationalist than Thimi Sambuddha? I mean, to me, he was the first Tibetan nationalist. Really, first Tibetan nationalist, first Tibetan, one of a kind. And then, so that was really dealing with the early sort of like phase of development of Buddhism in Tibet. Now I want to talk a little bit about this later phase. Again, this is with the view to understand the richness of Tibetan literary practices. So when I was reading about 4 schools of Buddhism, and I was really very amazed with the contributions that each school has made to Tibetan Buddhism. Each school had their own founders. You can read very easily. Really very marvelous teachers. And then each school had so many scholars who kind of like worked very hard to establish monastic institutions and whatnot in order to ensure that people would be able to practice their lineage. So what I'm trying to suggest here is these 4 schools of Buddhism, they are uniquely Tibetan in character. They are the indigenous aspect of Buddhism. And it's something that we all must celebrate as a part of our, cultural heritage, as a part of our national consciousness raising, kind of perspective. And of course, there are so many cultural heroes, icons. If you read one school of Buddhism, you'll find so many. But I just want to share with you just 1 or 2 of them here. One is Putin. And if you look at the works of Putin, he actually cataloged, he systematized Kangyur and Tengyur almost single-handedly. What a marvelous contribution. And then I began to wonder, when did this thing, Dewey, like decimal system, when was this introduced in the West? It was introduced after 500 years in 1876 by this Melville Dewey, which again revolutionized and transformed the library cataloging system. So again, really, Putin is such a wonderful cultural icon for us in terms of his contribution to cataloging system. I'm not very sure to what extent Melville Dewey may have benefited from Putin's work, but that might be a very interesting research Really. You never know because cultures kind of like cross back and forth. So, and then second one I want to bring to your attention is Tangdong Gyabo. So I was reading about Tangdong Gyabo. Mr. Teshizini, he shared with me an article in Lungda or something. Actually, he wrote the article. And Tangdong Gyabo is such an interesting cultural icon for us. You know, and people have described him in many different ways. One said he is the Leonardo da Vinci of Tibet. That's a huge recognition, really, international kind of recognition. Another said he is the wizard of Tibet because he actually built these 108 suspension bridges. I mean, that's quite a engineering feat, particularly at that time. I don't know if there were like suspension bridges in other parts of the world. I'm not very sure. I haven't done research in that aspect. But he did that in Tibet. And then, of course, he gave us this Ajilamo, this Tibetan opera. And Tibetan opera he developed as a way to teach Buddhism in a very powerful and effective way, in which he combined serious business teaching with entertainment. I mean, really, what a creative, innovative individual he was. To this day, we enjoy actually, watching Tibetan opera, Ajilamo. And of course, these are really spiritual in nature as well. So I think we should not forget that. Well, let me quickly, I don't know, okay. I'm getting worried. Well, I just want to really summarize my sort of like thinking in terms of these four schools of Tibetan Buddhism. So from around 9th, 10th century till about 19th century, I think we could easily say this was the golden period of Tibetan Buddhism. There was a lot of literary production in Tibet, a lot of literary production. A lot of monastic institutions were established. They attracted a lot of students from countries like Mongolia, China, and India, Nepal as well. And so, I actually pose a question here, and I really wonder, since Tibet has had this kind of interactions with outside countries, why we didn't develop this sense of nationalism? Because generally, nationalism is developed in interaction with other countries. So that interaction is very, very important because that really sort of like rekindles your interest in terms of your national. So that is something, I haven't done research, but so this is what they said, Snellgrove and Richardson. They use this term apotheosis, which means you have reached the highest level of accomplishment. And I'm not really kind of like, saying this from myself, but other scholars who have looked at the richness of Tibetan literature, Tibetan Buddhism, they have said that Tibet had reached at that time this highest level of accomplishment. So I think this is something that we all can be very proud of. Hence, I've been telling you that we have this abundance of like religious text, really. So again, I think this indigenous aspect of Tibetan Buddhism, along with Tibetan language, must be considered as a very essential aspect of Tibetan national identity, as well as national consciousness. Okay, and then of course also I began to wonder, why there wasn't any sort of like interest, or should I say, studies done, when these were so kind of like robust sort of like literary production was taking place in Tibet, but there wasn't any interest paid to nationalism. And so I realized there wasn't any ideology, because you need an ideology like the middle way approach in order to engender interest in nationalism. So really there wasn't any sort of like an ideology that would sort of like bring us all together in terms of exploring this nationalism issue. So that is my hypothesis. I could be really wrong. And then look at the next one. Religion is the most comprehensive idea system imagined by humankind. Modern nationalism is thus a perversive religion-induced culture. So I think if you look at this actually observation by Nawang, you can easily say that our nationalism really fits well into this kind of a conception. Okay, now I'm going to draw your attention particularly to our recent history experience. So I've titled this as Tibetan Nationalism Under Siege. Of course, the greatest threat to Tibetan national identity came during and before Cultural Revolution. And we all know, particularly during Cultural Revolution, there was a wanton destruction of Tibetan cultural artifacts. In fact, Heather Stewart, she estimated that 95% of Tibetan cultural artifacts were destroyed during Cultural Revolution. And she also says that there is one library in Pempo, very close to the Lhasa area. This library was set to fire, and it took 3 weeks to burn the whole thing down. But of course, I have no sense of what is the ferocity of the fire, or was it like, set, off and on. I have no idea, but it took 3 weeks. That is a long time for a library to be burned down. So I think, we can get a sense of the kinds of books and things that were stored in that library would be really just tremendous. That may be the reason why it took so long. But this is what she said. And then, of course, during the Cultural Revolution, the first tiger was this Yumbulagang, the first palace of King of Tibet. Because Chinese knew that this actually stands for Tibetan nationality. It is symbol of Tibetan nationality. Hence, they felt it was very important for that to be brought down. Now, this is really interesting observation shared by Mr. Karme. The more repression that took place in Tibet, the more intense the Tibetans felt to preserve the Tibetan culture. So there was this direct relationship between the degree of destruction and the intensity of desire to preserve Tibetan culture. It is because of this, actually, I'm challenging this rupture notion. A rupture has not taken place at all. In fact, there was continuity of Tibetan literary works connected with the past. I think what might have really happened is Tibetan nationalism or Tibetan national identity went underground so that it is invisible to the Chinese officials. But underground doesn't mean that it disappeared. In fact, I would say there was a lot of activities taking place underground. Otherwise, one cannot imagine overnight sort of like rekindling of Tibetan nationalism. It must be rooted to the past. I'm positive. Again, I was trying to say this. Renan, who said, pain bonds more. Because of the traumatic experiences that Tibetans have gone through during Cultural Revolution, I think their desire to preserve Tibetan culture must have grown manifold. So these are just some quotations from Lama Jab's work. And basically what he has said in this is the past and the present, they kind of like intersect with each other to ensure that there is a very productive nature of literacy practices. And not only that, this kind of like pays very close attention to Tibetan national identity. So I was really very impressed that Tibetans actually find a way to express their national identity, their national consciousness. Although they're living under this, huge, government that controls every move in Tibet. But still Tibetans are so courageous particularly the artists, writers, poets, they find a way to express their dreams, their aspirations, their victories, their sufferings, their pains. I think the more we read, the more we will relate to their, experiences. I think it's very important part of our responsibility, people living in exile, that we must establish this psychological link with them. So that should we reunite, it'd be much easier for us to bond together. Am I right? Because we have already established this psychological link with them. We don't want to have this rupture, which would be really very unhealthy and unproductive. Okay. So look at this actually. I just want to share one poem. Of course, there are many poems from Tibet, but I kind of wanted to share this with you because this is written by a Sinophone writer, Chinese writer, a Tibetan writing in Chinese language. And I think he was, in fact, a Chinese kind of official at some point. And, you can see his photo too, Yedam Siring actually, but they write like this, Yedam. His name is Yedam Siring. And he wrote this poem. The world I was born in was a pure soil protected by Dharma. But at the door of the honest and kind-hearted, one could often hear the howls of the demon. I mean, he was so courageous. And when he says pure soil, that means he's making reference to Tibet before the occupation by China, when Buddhism was practiced very freely. So he's so courageous and so clever in making this kind of an indirect reference. And then look at the door of the honest and kind-hearted. He's making, this is the boundary between China and Tibet, the door. Between the Dharma-loving and non-loving and kind and non-kind kind of stuff. So he's really conjuring up all kinds of images for us. Look at the next one. One often hears the howls of the demon. I mean, really. Very courageous. He's making this direct reference to the, Chinese Communist Party. And then, when I read this article written by Dantop, and I really liked what he said here. I think this sort of like captures the essence of what I'm trying to say. By drinking from one's cultural reservoir, one not only asserts one's identity, but maintains the integrity and conscience of a people. So this is really basically, he's emphasizing we must stay true to our Tibetan heritage. That means when you're drinking Tibetan tea, you must drink from a Tibetan cup, which shows sort of like a lineage thing. So, I really thought this is such a powerful statement. Okay. So I think I'm done, with regard to some background information. I hope you find them interesting. Now, really coming down to the meat of my presentation. This work is very much based on the works of Dao Nobu. Because for me, he is one scholar who has done so much work on nationalism. Particularly his book, Culture and the Politics of Third World Nationalism. It's very, very relevant for us. To read and really read between the lines, so to speak. Although he may not make direct reference to Tibetan nationalism, but I think we can glean a lot of information from his work and see to what extent they can be applied to our situation. So this is what I've actually tried to do here. So he says there are two categories of nationalism. One is the traditional one, which is pretty much based on race, language, territory, tradition, and the very sort of like typical way of defining nationalism. The second one is based on egalitarian ideology. So he uses the term ideology. An ideology that is based on freedom, equality and fraternity. So, he mentions these two different categories of nationalism. So I'm adding the third one, which is the Tibetan nationalism. To me, Tibetan nationalism does not fit into both of these categories. Let me tell you the reason. Because I do see differences between egalitarian ideology and altruism-based ideology, which is pretty much what defines Tibetan nationalism, compassion-based type of nationalism. In egalitarian nationalism, there is emphasis on equality. What I get, you get. It should be like equal. If I get 50%, you must get 50%. That ends, at least, this notion of equality, egalitarian. Whereas in this compassionate or transcendental, sometimes I tend to use this, nationalism, the other's interest is more important than your own interest. So it really doesn't fit into this egalitarian nationalism. And then if you really study egalitarian ideology, it is an end in itself. Whereas in this transcendental national, it is more of a process. It is a continual process of negotiation, thinking back and forth. So, again, there lies one difference. And then, again, this is one major difference. Egalitarian ideology is based on social justice concept. Social justice. Whereas compassion ideology is based on kind of like altruism. And then egalitarian, to me, is a little bit subtractive. You're taking one and giving one kind of, somehow, haven't really thought through this. But whereas egalitarian, this transcendental is much additive. So because of this, I think we need to add a third category, which is the transcendental or compassionate-based kind of nationalism. So I'm trying to really propose that Tibetan nationalism sort of like fits into this category. Okay. So now, okay. So we are done with these categories of nationalism. Now I'm trying to look at the Tibetan nationalism structure itself. What does Tibetan nationalism look like? Again, of course, my work is based on Nawang Phuntsog's work, but I added, my own contributions as well. So what he said, nationalism has three components. One is tradition. I describe all kinds of stuff so far. So that is my way of really looking at the tradition. Because the tradition is very important. It's a source of inspiration. It ensures continuity from the past to the present to the future. So, tradition is very, very important. So, we have gone over that actually at length. We have very rich textual kind of like, aspect of religion. We have a lot of like cultural heroes, and then the language, a common language, and of course, richness of collective historical, cultural, and kind of, memories from the past. So that constitutes one part of Tibetan nationalism. The second one is called the interest. And again, he uses this very sort of like, ordinary term interest. I would have used something else, but he uses this term, so in recognizing his scholarship, I'm using the same term, interest. For me, we all have this interest to reunite with our brothers and sisters in Tibet. I think this is like a burning interest issue for all of us. And not only that, we want to walk on the land of Tibet. We want to go and drink the water from the streaming, like rivers of Tibet. We want to roll on the ground of Tibet. We want to go and touch those mountains. Amne Machin, am I right? And, all those mountains. We want to engage in this practice of mountain worship. And so, we have this huge urge, am I right? Really huge urge to reunite and really walk on the grounds of Tibet. I think that's very important, kind of, at least for me. And then, of course, we cannot forget our diaspora, political, educational, kind of like social issues. Because we can't be thinking always of the aspiration, but we must be also grounded. Otherwise, we would miss the boat, so to speak. And then the next one is, he calls ideals. So to me, middle way approach, whether we like it or not, is the only ideology we have at our disposal. I mean, I have not come across, like something that will really work, in our current situation. And so, so middle way approach is an ideology for us, something that will guide us in terms of developing our, nationalism. So all these three factors could actually very well come together. I think I have it here, somewhere here. Okay. What he says is these three components of Tibetan nationalism could really forge a very powerful social movement, particularly during the time of crisis. And I cannot imagine a crisis more crucial than what we are now experiencing. I really cannot. Because in terms of what is taking place in Tibet, what is happening in our own diaspora situation, we are really in a crisis situation, whether we accept it or not. So we have this perfect storm, so to speak. Now, all we need, he says, is a charismatic leadership. Now, what is the quality of this charismatic leadership, according to Nawang? He says, this charismatic leadership is someone who is able to interpret the rich cultural heritage of your community and then forge it with this ideology. See? So hopefully this will take place. Now let me see, I think, all right, so I think, let me just see what else I need to say. I have so much, here to share with you, but, I think I want to just, one quick, deeply rooted in the past, traditional culture is not anti-progress. I can bring this to our attention. Many times people tend to criticize tradition and culture. But I think Tibetan culture is very adaptable culture. It is not anti-progress, am I right? It is not anti-democracy. It is not anti-modernization. So it can easily adapt and change in order to achieve a goal. So I think that's something very important for us to keep in mind. And then as I was telling you, when I was thinking as to why there is no any reference to Tibetan nationalism or national consciousness or national identity in the literature before occupation of Tibet by China, I think one reason is there was lack of ideology. We were so busy in terms of disseminating Buddhism across the land or country. But we did not really pay attention in terms of what does it mean to have our own territory? What does it mean to have our own sort of governance? What does it mean to have our own sovereignty and things like that, So somehow, I'm not, trying to finger point and say he or she is wrong, no. But it seems there was lack of ideology, that may have prevented us from developing a very strong sense of Tibetan nationalism, at least in the past. So that is one observation. Let me see what I wrote here. So let us make the Sleeping Beauty an icon of universal compassion rather than a Frankenstein's monster. And really, just the thought of a Sleeping Beauty waking up one day in the morning like a monster is really, to me, very disturbing. I'm going to have a sleepless night, really. And so, we have this responsibility to make sure that this Sleeping Beauty really turns out to be truly a beautiful icon of whatever we aspire for or cherish. So I think that is something, we should pay attention. Now, coming down to my research, I think I have offered, all this sort of 4 sections as a way to really present a context to my study, to provide a background to my study. And to me, the background is as important as the study itself, because the background really provides the direction to your study. And so, before I actually undertook this data collection, I had to study myself. What should I really investigate? Is there actually room for me to investigate? Is there a Tibetan nationalism that can be investigated? So all these were like personal challenges for me. And so I had to read and really find out to make sure that, like there is this sort of like background information for me in order to proceed forward. Otherwise, like it's going to be hit and miss type of situation. So then, having done all this background work, I, was able to then sit down and develop my questionnaire, my interview questionnaire. Otherwise, my interview questionnaire is going to be a very sort of like lopsided, not very, effective in terms of collecting data. So very quickly, of course, my original interest on Tibetan nationalism was kind of like a direct interest. I became interested to explore the notion of role of schooling in the process of nationalism production. And particularly, I was interested in terms of how do children in the classroom, they harness, they kind of like capture this sense of nationalism when they engage in different activities. When you sing Tibetan national anthem, how do you really capture this Tibetan spirit, this Tibetan nationalism? Am I right? Or are you just singing a song? Or are you really emotionally embedded in the singing of the act? So there are differences. So I was really interested in that. So that was sort of like my driving interest. And so then, of course, I read, what is the sort of like, basic educational philosophy, things like that. And then I realized that a very important principle of basic education is altruism, as very important facet of Tibetan identity. So then I want to explore this intersection of Tibetan identity, secular ethics, and nationalism in the schooling context. And so, I developed questions, of course, before I go and collect data from the children, I needed to know, what is the perspective of Tibetan education ministers? Because they're the ones who actually formulate education policies or statements or mission statements for the Tibetan children in exile. So I interviewed them. I asked them questions. What is their thinking on Tibetan nationalism? Do they think it's important to be included in the schooling process? And then what is the role of middle way approach and secular ethics in the Tibetan nationalism construction? Do they complement each other, or do they kind of like contradict each other? So, these were the three or more questions I wanted to explore in my research. I don't know, I don't have a lot of time, huh, Kijila? Do I have enough time or no?
Yeah.
Okay. What happened here? Okay.
Maybe 5 minutes.
Okay.
There are some questions.
Oh, okay. So these are, should I say, some observations from the interview I'm just sharing with you. I interviewed 4 former education ministers, and there was a great deal of consensus that there is indeed complementariness. That means each one reinforces the other. Middle way approach, secular ethics, in fact, reinforce, strengthen Tibetan nationalism. None of the individuals I interviewed, they said there's some kind of a contradiction. So I think this itself is a win-win, a wonderful situation for us. And then middle way approach is a mutually beneficial solution. And I really like this. Middle way approach is, in fact, a secular ethics in action. If we truly believe in secular ethics, am I right? This issue of rest and virtue and things that His Holiness has really emphasized, and then I think we should not have any problem in terms of moving forward with middle way approach. And then, teaching compassion in school will never undermine Tibetan nationalism. I think that is true. In fact, it will strengthen Tibetan nationalism, which is, in fact, very transcendental in nature. And then, again, Tibetans have a responsibility to engage in compassionate action since they are considered to be the disciples of Buddha of compassion. What else I want to say? I think, this is what I want to say, last part of my, really speaking, Tibetan nationalism could become a very powerful kind of driving force for all of us. Is it in a perfect format? I'm not able to say at this point. But nevertheless, it's something that we must really think deeply. We must investigate. Otherwise, this likelihood of sleeping beauty become a monster is quite, quite close by. What else I want to say? Okay. So now, children are really the future leaders of Tibet. Right now, we are discussing all this middle way approach, secular ethics, and Tibetan nationalism. But the future is going to be shaped by our children who are being schooled in the Tibetan schools these days. So I wanted to get a sense from them. This is not a complete picture, but a sense from, what do they think about the relationship between Tibetans and Chinese in the long run. So I'm going to take you to the future a little bit, not a whole lot. Look at some of these drawings here. I don't know whether you can see or not. See here, Tibet is free, but yet, they're like, Chinese flag and Tibetan flag, they're standing together. So they do have hope that we can coexist. Am I right? Look at the next one here. She wrote something here, but anyway, I think the one close to the Tibetan flag is a monk. And anyway, what she is saying is, it doesn't matter whether you believe in religion or not. We all are human beings. We could all coexist. And so I think it's very hopeful. At least they're very open-minded. Am I making sense? They're very open-minded. They're willing to explore and at least, foresee the future, so to speak. So this one actually I translated because it's kind of, a little bit difficult to see. If the unity of Tibet and China becomes as deep as the ocean, very poetic, and as wide as the sky, both will benefit and prosper. This is not only my perspective, but Tibetans share it, especially His Holiness Dalai Lama. Then she lists some qualities like loving kindness and things like that. So, so these are the references, and I think, I end my presentation here. So now it's open to questions, right?
Tibet, tabu kurang ngati wadai.
Oh, let's sebenarnya.
Sekarang ngadil tak pergi nak jadi ini cing atau mendua. Jadi ngadil di kolom nang di cik dan ngadu cik cina pendo inggu sama raci. Kasi dah kolom tu jadi pendo je korwa. Jadi nationalism sih di tang ngadu jeje segiro ya na jekab le jewo cebas. Susu subul jewo cebas tirar wa. Ngadu susu subul jewo kadu cek dosa na. Nani karo nyang tu ini sini main rasa kaji jewo cek gosu doa. Ti medu inggu mendoa. Jadi tanji cerang kita nationalism di tindi mewa de kari na sedu. Tinggal thona diji chungsu do ideology cikbu aina samarach sobo di kange shira mati do ini tu kol shira he magoche tik point cik do tan chana dina ne kange chite yung ini hine o dang do ru che go do che go do se yung do chada tin totan cikba subul jewo che dan jagabul jewo che dan jikari ne totan cikba re sha samarach te samlo tan linge cik tu me se yung samarach tenso ini cik dan da karso da khaji tenso da sama hyung me chanda cik dan da nge teba cik de tinyi to sang yang se te de yodi. Others before self-love and altruism and I think it is to the Marabdo Chagre. Some logic dana. Kansana Inda India, which showed you what the Ranli Hienche, what Natango Nangju gets our huge Guyorwa. In a Jamgurubuch Rangi soon now Lola, Jaminiam the Devachi, Kangi the Carasana, Jamil Kayo, Amjo Yomaris. Tangazukan Kat Diche, a lecture here. Nganzu ki dungi de chigi nyingi marwa. Tindi kita netan gawa ne, nganzu kita susungwa ne chigi be de jaji sangpo che gore sero na, cham nyingje gore sero na, ene rangli xin che ba che gore sesa di, chidang zambuling sangma ingi de lakbar du tanda nganzu kapde jaksa di gemirwa. Kola amjo me du kare siya gorda. Nganzu di xiene pendo kare yor, kar tuku kare siya chigi, di tiba chigi tanda len yo na me na kandar nganzu, di gungpo xie pe keshin gore xie, len yu, ta tse gorwa. Tanda nganzu kita, Hiryang Tony in and secular ethics Tony in the Tuzu Cheva Tony Pagi Kamada de la Trout 2 years so you lend them to go. Oding of the some of the Ketchmuresha. The Professor Kitching Jungin, the Majan and the Marasam Judi, the landing in Kirara, see what you do some good. The Masik and Namju Nangju Jandu in the Timina Chamani to go to Higiorwa. He do okay, the Agora Suna Marising. Then you dinyam to ya Hirab Gore, Namju Pejo Dani. Rava, a uncle Tampo Majestra, Dunlin Shukcheto Chegorsi, Dikita Mached, any Karina Kur digging Jizo Jesuan, Katam and Jizo Swage in Yangachi. Chayag, they're singing the Topajis Eldoro. Did you did Nanga Simulate tons? Or teaching in the Sunasams, any Tibet in the Union.
Taming land sugar. Tab Chamju Tonia Karsurta, Kunju Tanti, Nini Ketchum Shoes Tungu. Tapena Punalia Canane, Gemon Bushu Jungor, Lasal Jungore. In Konsupaga Yonda, bet Konsu something bet Jodor, Manguchi Munerta. Konsu Peppa sing it in one eternity, the Gansu, the girls Konsu Karsurta, to do that during as a charity, Tandu Chulia Karsurta, Muzo Shua Savlia, Tandu Charity, Tandu Quansbeck, managers, and quarters gave Charab said they to this Yamin the Mangushachum. Chesa Konsu Amjola Mandrovine, Konsu Gansu Peppa, going to the Chamnish on the Tempati. Action speaks louder than words. The engineer says to the Orba. Chasing a chick kishla did some. Karsure, one of the game mango. I think it did to the halfway said that the Nagi to work the theatre to the civil lavina. Lost the Yamara de Ugre. In an auto, the Gangi de solution to Guyorba. The solution, Jimmy Monzo, Shidamare. I wanted in, I wanted to do, wanted to cut a email. Now, what did you do? Sitting in Pungudu, I'm joy that did it. That the convenience so as you could have this that the way that you were saying the one at it can be very gradual, or can be revolutionary. That thing was Shilabshan Yomata. Whenever you would want to cheese cigarettes and you were Chamudan Drosig, Canada, Penalia. One overnight in it. So you show alone and when you switching is the young cigarette. The in among Chayuat is very gradual, very slow kind of process. The Yine we have to believe in our own movement. Maranso Chik Summer Tanging and the social action consciousness, the ratio carrying the Dinali and believe we have to move forward. Otherwise, if you remain hopeless, that is the end of Tibetan nationalism. That's the end of Tibetan identity. We have to keep very optimistic. And I'm very, very positive. Chinese leaders will undergo change. There's no way they can remain in this sort of like bubble. Impossible. In the history of the world, no kingdom or no ruling class, no king has remained like that. Look at the history. How long can they remain like this? One day the bubble is going to burst. Definitely. These leaders are not just, always sitting in some kind of like, some kind of, room, a closed room, but they are also interacting with public, other individuals, things like that. So I think there is really hope.
So what is for you anti-national? Because looking at the event in New York recently, when certain views, any view, is at variance with the masses, that person is branded as like anti-national, anti-Tibetan struggle, anti-whatever. So.
Of course, I don't have the real context of what you're suggesting, but for me, an act would be anti-national if the act undermines the interest of the Tibetan community. if it does not really further the interest, the goals of Tibetan, say Tibetan community or Tibetan nationalism, and if it hinders the efforts of actualizing or realizing Tibetan national interest, that would be kind of anti, because it's not really adding anything positive. It is a negative contribution in terms of the national movement moving forward with its goals and with its sort of I think that would be my understanding, my conception of anti-nationalism. I think that's a very good question, though, because one can be very, pro-nationalism, or one can be very sort of anti-nationalism too.
Or one can be branded as anti-nationalism, although maybe not anti-nationalism.
Right, one can be mistaken to be anti-nationalism, but in his heart, maybe he has, is exploring a different route to get to the same point. So sometimes, because the differences of the path that we take, people tend to brand each other as anti or pro, whatever. We have seen that. And I think those are really, one should not be very quick to label someone. I think we should really prevent this. We are a very small community, we are very small. And we have a very urgent task. It is not that we have the luxury to kind of label each other and then sort of engage in kind of long-term whatever. Really, we have no time. We are in this crisis mode. Really speaking, Tibetan national identity is under threat. It is really, under a huge kind of threat of almost termination type. So really we have no time. I think we should be very cautious in terms of labeling each other. We must engage in discussion more, and then really understand each other's perspectives and views before we label someone. I think very quickly labeling someone is very, very dangerous. That can easily lead to a lot of divisiveness, unnecessary divisiveness, unnecessary loss of momentum, unnecessary loss of human resources. I think we should avoid this kind of practices in the future.
Samju Nagishla di tanda amjo yomare any chiboshi digson dinga samju ro shuna sams jida tanda the solution di todo chinganzolia. As far as I can tell, ngal tanda komaso dinde shengi din shumaso ine nganju dinde tasajik ngedi tumudu yedong gel ya tanda pe kyong da yulen di pa pyuni ani kensu nanglia pebegi rangyong saku ani situen nanglia dine shinka da perangong jutsebe nanglolia di chungdu gambalya pebegi thinker, the writer Mangbuchi, Pujutain and the Pan Tibetan identity, says Jura. Pan Tibetan consciousness.
Ah, Pan, okay, right.
In early 50s or in late 80s to late 96, Pebegi protest Mangbuchi confined to respective religion, respective community. That you don't get the that Quran. Tanda shokdung krang ki share man share liya tanda Pan Tibetan consciousness the sovereignty awareness the gain of national pride the dinle ngonju gi di dinju gi perspective ne draw chewa ina tanda nyedong ge gi jel ya kana nanglo liya thakbar du nyedong gu tanda east Turkestan nanglo liya tanda singje di chuni kana nanglo liya debate scholarly debate shuchum shuchungro this do gabalia in short run delia tanda atinde karsore policy alternative inere any law changes the chungyu marte in the long run then nanglo ya duwa the no one could have imagined the Soviet Union collapse. No one could have imagined the Berlin Wall collapse. And dollar sunet and the Kena Nanglodia domestic politics this tangi bana dual talks do the ora talk about the tanda Sunny US trade friction like unit war like unit dito neta bana Kena leadership compound Nanglodia
there's a rift
between Premier Li Keqiang and President Xi Jinping that we couldn't see, but we could at least hear from the some informal channels.
Yeah.
So the day to netawa na tende chikar sore taya chida rewaj tende rushi meru samudu.
Ngadi siyo di ngazu de samlo taya shud. Chida de optimistic chepe yakwarwa. Karina Zambuling Jurgre, Saint Jurbi Pedus of Mangbo Tang, or in the hair and Zambuling Nal Mangbo. Tina Tata Communal Sungsuma, Tizukida Yomar Singazul. The Goog de Yamado. Tambenale Jato Wepung, Pure Wepungs. The Yates Mena Samgurgi. Jigni Digi Nine, Tayaksa did to Tanga Yoreda. Papa Jabjur Ching, you're a Jamil Kapte Chang to rock watching it, Conference 2 dinner resolution, Yapo Chunson, then the Jura Dosso said in the Kawaii and Jura Door, that time the Yorwa. You didn't get to one Kartangresana. The Puna, you can go to huge de Yore data, cook up Konashida Yomarwa. Tango Jabjuna digging, Hiyu and Jonathan, the Kandetoni, Kapte momentum to Dugan Angela. This is going.
Like presentation on any Carson's Lana, Nanzu Pebagi nationalism, the any rapture Shukshambu Jigle Mares, any Anso, any continuity, the Ansuki maintain Chires, any on this song do you can Carson's Lana, Ansuki pass labi revisit Mambuchi race, any pass la revisit Chidu, any nationalism like Hadu in a history the Pekishan Buddha, history the memory pe link Shuksambura, and Midinzula history the memory sense Shukshambu Jigana, Ansu Pebachilla in there. Altruistic, I mean, compassionate, color, the nationalism, leg, like Kerangit color. Possibly Tongo de Angani, Sheras Tongim into. The Anzu Galaxy and past visit Chiore, any past revisit China, obviously history tower, Suzuki memory in Tower, and then Zunala Yakumigi Mambuchunera, no one digi. The Nansu is still altruistic, the compassionate Chikandis Chituguna.
But you are absolutely right. Past is not always rosy and glorified. We have also dark sides to our past that we must acknowledge. Otherwise, we are not being authentic to ourselves and authentic to the history of Tibet. So I acknowledge that. But of course, we want to emphasize the positive aspects of Tibetan culture. Negatives, who wants negative? Really speak, no one wants negative. We must always lie. Past, read it. Okay.
Altruistic nationalism, conventional food,
okay. See, that is actually the time opportunity for us to develop compassion. If you miss that, you have missed the boat. I'm not a Buddhist scholar, but really, when you suffer, when you go through this traumatic experience, that is the time to develop compassion. That is not the time for us to resort to violence. Again, that will lead to more violence, more violence. What good is that type of approach or thinking? That really speaking, compassion is the most effective tool that we have. Most effective. Of course, you and I may not realize the effectiveness right away. But you really think deeply, this is the one that will actually, should I say, I don't know to use the word conquer, but it is the one that will, lead to positive outcomes. Other perspectives may provide some positive, but not to the extent that compassion will really lead us to. This is the only tool we have. This is the only reason why other people love Tibetans. This is one attribute that people from all over the world, they appreciate. And the time will come when Chinese leaders will appreciate. How long can they keep on going, be non-compassionate? I think it is just not within the human nature. As His Holiness has frequently reminded us, it is against our humanity. It is against the very core of humanity to be non-compassionate, to be filled with hatred, to be filled with anger. It is so dehumanizing for the oppressor and for the oppressed. It is not a win-win situation at all. So I truly believe in compassionate Tibetan nationalism. Thank you.